Hi, I'm Eduardo Norret. I'm with Campus Reform. Let's get right to it. We have two great guests today. The first, you'll know him from the Daily Wire and, of course, his show, The Michael Knowles Show. He is joining us, and along with U.S. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Let's get to it right why we're here. The Verdict podcast. I interviewed Michael about the podcast several months ago. We didn't have the senator there with us. And at the time, the show was just starting off about what it was created for, to talk about impeachment. So Senator Cruz, my first question is for you. How has the show evolved since then, now that it's moved into a show about general political commentary? I mean, what can viewers expect now that the show has continued past the impeachment trial?
Well, thanks, Eduardo. The reason we launched the podcast was to actually get into real substance and to get around the gatekeepers, to get around the media, to get around the bias and actually discuss what's going on. And this has been a project, actually, Michael and I have been talking about for over a year. Long before impeachment, we were talking about wanting to do a podcast because, look, I think as conservatives, we've got to do a lot more to win people's hearts and minds. Margaret Thatcher famously said, first you win the argument, then you win the vote. We're in the midst of the great debate between free enterprise and socialism. We're in the midst of a radical leftist assault on free speech and religious liberty and all of our basic constitutional liberties. And if you rely on the mainstream media, they're not going to defend any of it. And so we've got to actually, if we're going to talk about the American founding, we should talk about what was extraordinary about it and where the challenges were. And so the podcast was designed. We launched it, as you know, during impeachment. The very first podcast was the first day of impeachment, and we did it live. We did it real time.
In the middle of the night.
In the middle of the night. So I'd be on the Senate floor for the impeachment trial. It would finish at midnight, 1 a.m, hop in a truck, head to the studio, and we'd shoot live at 2 a.m, or whenever the trial ended. And every night we just try to say, okay, what happened? And that was a good example of really complicated factual issues, legal issues, constitutional issues. If you were trusting CNN to tell you what was going on, you wouldn't know what was going on, and people wanted to understand.
That was our premise going in, was that people are smart, people are interested in their government. They don't just want kind of 5-minute, quick little sound bites. They actually want to know, but you've got to engage them. So one thing that was really beneficial, I think, for my own understanding, you can be as much of a political nerd as you want. You watch C-SPAN all the time for those hearings, but you're not getting a behind-the-scenes look. And so Senator Cruz would show up to the set, and he'd tell me, I was talking to Senator so-and-so, then we went in the cloakroom, we heard this bad argument, so we talked to the Chief Justice, and it gave you this view of what's going on here. The senator has been a little humble, actually, because we know, great political leader.
Something I'm rarely accused of.
I know. Well, the place you've been humble is great great senator, great podcaster. He beat Joe Rogan for a week and a half, just saying. But Senator Cruz is also an amazing booking producer, because one thing that we really like to do on the show, if there's an issue, let's say it involves the DOJ, well, we'll talk about the issue, Senator Cruz will break it down, and then we'll talk to the Attorney General. We'll bring him on, as we did a few weeks ago, or we'll talk to some of your colleagues in the Senate. And I think that there's so much negative to be said about social media and how they're clamping down on us, but one great advantage of this new medium format of podcasting is you can break through, you can have a real substantive conversation on the terms that you are setting for yourselves and for the audience.
Well, and Michael, I think that's a good example of what the podcast is all about. So during impeachment, we did it every night, real time, trying to give really the inside story of what's happening in the cloakroom, what's happening in the Senate, how is it going to be resolved. After that, we tried to address just the issues that are happening, and we've had a number of guests on. Actually, I think a couple of weeks ago, having Bill Barr on was a good example. You watch Barr in an interview, and he's very good in an interview. He does a media interview, typically with some hostile lefty reporter who's like trying to do gotcha question, and Bill is pretty buttoned up, and he answers the questions. But, Barr and I have been friends for 25 years. And the difference of the podcast that I think a lot of people watching it were surprised is we're sitting there, and for a half hour, we're just talking. We're Michael and I are not trying to play gotcha games where, okay, aha, we cut, but we're trying to ask, all right, what about this? What about that? And you see Bill laughing. You see his sense of humor. By the way, I was astonished. So I during the, where I'm going to go. During the podcast, I said, Bill Barr is the honey badger.
I was not expecting this claim to be made on the show, but it took me by surprise.
And what astonished me is Bill knew what I was talking about. Now look, Bill is older than we are. I wasn't sure he had followed the whole internet meme and the body, but Bill knew exactly what the honey badger was. And look, honey badger don't care. And it was, that was a fun, and we've had those over and over again in the podcast.
Yep.
So, Michael, I think you kind of touched upon it a little bit about what the hook is. I mean, you have this inside access, you have the smart analysis from the two of you, and you can give people a different side and a different look into what's really going on in Washington. Do you think this is the medium of the future? You've been experienced in digital media. There are obviously a lot of young Americans that get their media through the phones, through things like podcasts. I mean, are you seeing that play into your audience at all? And are you also, able to attract maybe older viewers who traditionally only go to cable, but now because they see what you guys are doing, they're able to come and listen to you guys and watch your show?
Absolutely. What we've tried to do is go to the audience. So as of now, I mean, they're probably kicking us off of these platforms as we speak, but we will go to wherever they are. We'll put it on YouTube, we'll put it on Apple Podcasts, we'll put it on Google Play and Stitcher. We'll just go all over the place because YouTube has a slightly older audience, the audio platforms have a slightly younger audience. I think the key here, and this is something we've had from the beginning, is you want to have respect for the audience. They are seeking out this content. It's not like linear TV where you turn it on and it's just whatever is playing. People have to come seek out this content, and they're coming because they want to know something about their government. And Senator Cruz is in a position where I think you do an excellent job, not only giving a little behind the scenes, but explaining what that means from a legal perspective, from a political perspective, from public policy perspective. And so I think as long as you're giving people something to learn, something that shows them about their government, they're going to keep coming back. And we're so pleased at the more than 10 million views that have already come onto the show.
Well, and we're trying to have fun with it. I mean, we try to cut up and laugh. I mean, look, most people don't want to have a, boring lecture from someone with a green eye shade. So we're cutting up, we're having fun. We're trying to include little insights. Like I remember we talked about, so on the Senate floor, you're allowed to drink two things. You're allowed to drink water and you're allowed to drink milk.
Yeah.
And the reason, and I actually read the precedent, it was, I think it was Everett Dirksen, if I remember correctly, although I don't have the precedent in front of me, where he was speaking on the Senate floor and he inquired of the presiding officer, I'm a bit thirsty. Is it permissible for someone to bring me a glass of milk? And the presiding officer said there's nothing in the Senate rules that prohibits milk. And the way the Senate works, that ruling became a precedent that is literally printed in a book called Riddick's Precedents that's in everyone's desk on the Senate. And it is written there now that you can get water, you can get milk. So you can't we're drinking coffee. This is not allowed on the Senate floor. And I have to admit, I've talked with a couple of my colleagues and said, all right, we're going to set it up where I'm happy to preside and get someone to ask, is it permissible to get a cup of coffee?
Set some real precedent.
And I'm going to give the same damn answer. There's nothing in the Senate rules that say you can't. And by virtue of saying that, it suddenly becomes true. It's almost speaking it into existence.
Except the problem is, Senator Cruz, is once you come out in favor of coffee on the Senate floor, I imagine a lot of your colleagues would oppose it just for that reason. But I want to get on to
They'll stop drinking coffee altogether. Right.
Yeah. I want to get on to some current event news.
You're underestimating the power of caffeine.
Yeah,
also true.
We could all use it, both political parties. Senator Cruz, today the Chinese government issued sanctions against you for bringing to light some of the human rights abuses that are going on in the country. I don't think you had any plans to vacation in China anytime soon, but what do the sanctions mean both to you but also to U.S.-China relations as we are trying to, the Trump administration is trying to get a better working relationship, get better trade deals from them? What does them sanctioning you and some of your Senate colleagues mean?
Well, look, I'm heartbroken that we're not going to be vacationing poolside in some Chinese concentration camp. I mean, God bless. Look, I view it as a badge of honor. The Chinese communists are murderers. They're torturers. There are 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps right now. They engage in human rights abuses. They engage in suppression. They engage in censorship. And by the way, their repressive policies are the direct cause of the coronavirus pandemic, which originated in Wuhan, China, and which when Chinese physicians and whistleblowers tried to stop it, the Chinese government threw them in jail. They punished them for trying to stop the disease, and the Chinese government was willing to let this spread across the globe. And so I I think China poses the single greatest geopolitical threat for the United States over the next century. And I've spent my entire tenure in the Senate standing up to China, standing up for America. And so they're particularly annoyed that I've spoken out for Hong Kong. And, you know, I can tell you last October, I traveled to Hong Kong and actually met with the protesters. You know, there were 2 million protesters in the streets standing up against Chinese oppression. And I did a Sunday show from Hong Kong dressed in all black, like in solidarity with the protesters. And the fact that the Chinese government sanctioned me today. So when I went to bed last night, I wasn't sanctioned by the Chinese government. So I went to sleep, and I woke up this morning, picked up my phone, which was my alarm clock, and the first thing I saw was a whole series of texts. Well, last night, the Chinese Communist government sanctioned you. And I'm like, look, that's a statement of fear. They are afraid of being called out, and they're reacting out of fear, and I'm going to keep calling them out and standing up against them.
Well, at Campus Reform, we agree with you that we think the Chinese government is a huge threat, not only because of what they do in the private sector, what they do towards our government, but what we've been reporting on is what they do on our college campuses. So I know you are very aware, and Michael is as well, of, you know, the research theft that goes on from professors and researchers who are hired by the Chinese Communist Party through the 1,000 Talents program. We have these Confucius Institutes that spread propaganda on campus. And while we are pleased to see that some of this is starting to be brought to light, and while action is being taken, there's always the argument that, is it enough? You know, should we do more? And I want to get both of your thoughts on this. Senator Cruz, I know some of your Senate colleagues have called for even further action. They want to make working under the 1,000 Talents plan a crime. They want to potentially ban all Chinese foreign students. You know, how far should we go? What else needs to be done in both of your estimations to really get the threat of the Chinese government off of our college campuses?
Well, listen, we need to do much, much more. I've introduced about a dozen different pieces of legislation, all focused on standing up to China, standing up to their human rights abuses, standing up to their censorship, standing up to their espionage, standing up to their theft of intellectual property, standing up to their infiltration of college campuses. You know, you talk about college campuses. On the Senate Armed Services Committee, I introduced legislation that passed that restricted Department of Defense funds from going to universities that have Confucius Institutes. And as a result, we've seen over a dozen Confucius Institutes across the country shut down because the legislation I introduced, it got bipartisan support, was passed into law. And the reason, as you understand it, look, colleges and universities, they're naive, and then the Chinese come offering money, and it's a little bit like the drug dealer at the at the junior high, you know, pulling open a trench coat and, psst, hey, try something, little kid. I mean, that's what the Chinese are saying. We'll give you money. We'll give you, look, a Confucius Institute. It's free. We'll teach your students Chinese. Isn't that great? And what too many of the academic administrators don't understand is these are bases for espionage, they're bases for propaganda. So the Chinese don't want anyone to know about Tiananmen Square. They don't want anyone to know about Hong Kong. They don't want anyone to know about the forced abortions in China and the one-child policy and the torture and the Uyghurs. They don't want any of that. They want to sanitize it, and too many of the universities go along with it. You know, there's a major research institution in Texas who I've met with multiple times where they would have as faculty members Chinese nationals who would be being paid by the Chinese Communist government more than they're making from the U.S. institution. And they would engage in theft where they'd be working on cutting-edge research. And suddenly, out of nowhere, a Chinese company would file for a U.S. patent on the identical research because the researcher physically stole it and sent it back. And what we've never seen, look, there's always been theft. There's always been intellectual property theft. I suspect the first guy that carved out a wheel, someone saw the wheel and went and made his own wheel. That's not new. That there are people who steal and do bad things. What's new? What has literally no history, no precedent in the history of humanity, is a nation state with trillions of dollars of resources pursuing espionage and theft of intellectual property as a strategy that they invest billions of dollars in, that they engage in as a national strategy aimed at world domination. That is profoundly dangerous, and I think our campuses are way too naive on it.
And by the way, the problem is not just on the China side of things. It's also on the university side of things.
Yes.
Because the fact is, when China tries to infiltrate these universities, they find fertile ground. They find arms outstretched. There's this irony. We've talked about it on the show. There's this irony that the left complains about institutional oppression, and yet the left controls all of the major institutions, most notably and especially higher education. So I think while we reform this narrow aspect with China infiltrating ideologically, practically, brings up national security threats, we also need to reform higher education itself. And this is an issue, obviously, the coronavirus lockdowns make that a good opportunity, and it's obviously one, Eduardo, that you at Campus Reform know very well.
Well, and let me add one other thing, Eduardo, on this. On China, one of the things that we've done in the Verdict podcast, we spent a lot of time on China, and early on in the coronavirus outbreak, we walked through the enormous evidence of Chinese complicity, and in particular, there are two different institutes in Wuhan, China, that were studying not just coronaviruses, but coronaviruses from bats. One of the institutes was a few hundred yards from the wet market where the outbreak first occurred. And we have laid out in significant detail the evidence. Now look, the media reacts, oh, it's a crazy conspiracy theory to say the Chinese did this. Let me be clear. The weight of the evidence is not that China manufactured this virus and deliberately released it to the world. I don't think it's not impossible, but I don't think the weight of the evidence supports
And
that.
we've never said that they did. We've never suggested that on the show.
What the weight of the evidence does suggest is that one or both of these labs was studying this virus. And it somehow escaped, accidentally escaped, whether through a human, a researcher, an animal. One way or another, it accidentally escaped. We know one of the things we walked through, the U.S. State Department had multiple wires prior to this pandemic raising concern about these labs, about their shoddy security, about about the risk that these labs could trigger a global pandemic. And the media doesn't want to cover it. It's one of the reasons why a podcast is so powerful, because we can put out on the Verdict podcast, all right, here are the facts, and let people assess them on the merits, because if you're trusting the New York Times to cover it, you're not going to get the facts.
Well, to both of your points, I mean, there is an institutional issue on the side of the colleges and universities, and some of the China experts I've spoken to have said, one of them said that he believes there are people in our government, our media, our schools who are basically compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. Would you both agree with that? I mean, would you characterize it as such that there's too many individuals in positions of power in our country who are compromised by the Chinese Communist Party?
It is simply a matter of fact that we could actually name some of these professors and officials at these universities. So we know that is happening. I suppose the question is, how widespread is the problem? How deep does it go?
Right.
Well, I guess it depends on what the word compromise means. Does that mean that the Chinese Communist government has incriminating video of some professor, strangling kittens under a full moon? Probably not.
Right.
But does it mean that they want to make money? Does it mean they're getting paid? Does it mean they're interested in the almighty dollar? Absolutely. And by the way, big media, they want access to the Chinese market. Corporations are more than happy to engage in censorship. Hollywood is more than happy to engage in censorship. And it's not that the Chinese have compromat on the producers. It's that they're looking at big bucks by the Chinese market or the NBA.
Yeah.
All right.
Right.
I'm a diehard Houston Rockets fan. You may remember last fall, Daryl Morey, the general manager, he tweeted out a really innocuous tweet. Stand for Hong Kong, stand for democracy. Now, most people on planet Earth didn't know who Daryl Morey was. I do because I love the Rockets, but if you're not a Houstonian, you didn't know who Daryl Morey was.
No, I actually forgot that he was with the Houston Rockets.
But then the Chinese government freaked out.
Yeah.
And they demanded an apology. And the NBA proceeded to grovel, to apologize. And by the way, you saw big NBA stars, people like LeBron James, give these, humiliating apologies to the NBA for daring to offend the communist overlords. Now, this is all about big bucks. And by the way, Nike pulled Houston Rockets merchandise from the Chinese markets in response to this. And the Rockets used to be very popular in China because Yao Ming played for years and it's an example of where they're compromised, and this is where the media, nobody wants to dare risk losing access to the market, and that is a serious challenge.
Well, and I think you've just brought up a great point, too, on the nature of media, which is that what the mainstream media would tell you is they're not compromised. Unless they've got video footage of them strangling kittens, then they're not compromised, and it's crazy to suggest otherwise. Whereas when you can break through those gatekeepers and have a little bit more of a nuanced and complex conversation, then you can actually get to the issue at hand and the institutional integrity that we're talking about.
Well, let me move on and ask you guys about DACA. That was big news this weekend when President Trump said here in Miami, where I am currently, that he was going to sign an executive order to give DACA recipients a path to citizenship. So we've covered DACA individuals from the perspective that many of them are students. A lot of them get special access to scholarship and funding on college campuses, which is its own separate issue. But President Trump's announcement seems in many ways like a betrayal towards the base. It's an exact 180 of what he ran on initially. What were both of your reactions to hearing that he said he was going to provide them a path to citizenship? Some have said, well, that's not exactly what the executive order is going to do. Obviously, time will tell. But what are your initial reactions?
Well, I was deeply disturbed. Amnesty is wrong. It's contrary to rule of law. It's not fair to millions of legal immigrants who followed the rules, who waited in line, who came here the right way. And it's also the president, no president has any authority to magically create a pathway to citizenship. That takes legislation passed through Congress and to sign into law by the president. And so when Barack Obama signed DACA, signed executive amnesty, it was a grotesque abuse of authority. He had been asked repeatedly by immigration advocates to create amnesty through executive power, and he'd said, I can't. I don't have the power. I am not a king. I am not an emperor, is what Barack Obama said. And then as the election neared, suddenly he became an emperor. He found his scepter, and he decreed it. That was wrong, and it was an abuse of power. So my response when I saw the interview with the president, I was dismayed, and I put out a tweet immediately in response that said this was wrong and unconstitutional when Barack Obama did it, and if Trump does this, it will be wrong and unconstitutional. And I got to say, Eduardo, I was encouraged that within a couple of hours of that interview, the White House seemed to be walking it back and seemed to be stepping back from that position. So I'm hoping that it was a misstatement, that it's not going to be actually the policy they try to do, because no president, Republican or Democrat, has the authority to violate federal immigration laws.
This is the problem, I think, for politicians with the lockdown, I've noticed, is sometimes they get trapped in Washington, D.C., and they don't hear what's going on outside around the country. And so I had precisely the same reaction. I'm pleased to see that it was being walked back. Whether this was a rogue advisor or a misstatement or whatever, that's fine. But it did seem clear to me that among the president's supporters and the grassroots and just about everybody, the reaction was more or less unanimous, and one doesn't get to hear that, if circumstances keep one in swampland where people have a very different point of view.
Absolutely. Well, as you both said, hopefully, the White House is serious in walking that back, and we'll have to see what happens. I want to ask you guys both about cancel culture. So in many ways, what we're seeing go on around the rest of the country right now with regards to statues, cancel cultures, attacking cultural items, our heritage, that was happening on college campuses for many years. In many ways, the campus was a microcosm for what we've seen now. As we approach the election, many are wondering, where's the Republican Party? As statues have come down across the country on our campuses and in our cities, many voters I've spoken to have said, if the Republican Party isn't going to stand up to this, if they aren't going to defend us from this, as our culture, our history, and our heritage are being attacked, then what is the point? I mean, what are they running on? As an example, Senator Cruz, some of your colleagues were debating whether to get rid of Columbus Day at a time when many of their own voters would be expecting them to defend Christopher Columbus. So I know, Senator Cruz, you're not running for re-election. Michael, I know you're not running for office, but from an advice perspective, what do you both think that the Republican Party should be running on? Why do you think they've been so quiet in many ways to defend against the statue vandals, the cancel culture, and those choosing to attack our history?
Senator, you're the pro.
Look, we should stand up for America. It's not complicated. We should defend our nation. We should actually, I think Republicans need to grow a backbone and need to stand up. We have seen the lunatic left has taken over the Democratic Party. The crazies, the most angry, America-hating voices are dominating the Democratic Party. And so we saw what for some started out as peaceful protests in the wake of George Floyd's killing become violent mobs engaged in physical assaults, engaged in arson, engaged in firebombs, engaged in murder, engaged in vandalism. And we need to protect this country. This was when we had Bill Barr on the podcast. We spent a lot of the time talking about anyone that engages in violent terrorism, anyone that engages in rioting needs to be prosecuted, needs to be put in jail for a long time. If you destroy a monument on federal property, that carries a 10-year prison sentence. And actually, Barr told us in the podcast that they had over 500 active investigations of people who had done that. And look, reasonable people can have a debate about whether a particular statue should stand or not. If you don't want it, all right, let's say you don't like the Christopher Columbus statue. Okay, we have a democracy. We have a democratic process. You can make an argument. We can debate it. And if you convince policyholders to change the policy, you can. I don't think we should be erasing history. I don't support that. But there's a process to do that. When a mob just goes and tears it down, it undermines who we are. And we've seen, so it started out as a debate over Confederate monuments. But very quickly we saw the mob start attacking George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant, because they were big Confederates. Lincoln and Grant were, and we saw Frederick Douglass
That's right.
defaced. This is not people standing up against slavery or racial injustice. These are Marxists who hate America and are tearing down our institutions. Look, I can tell you with all my strength, I am standing up and defending this country, and I hope we have a lot more leaders who will as well, and defend the American framers. Were they perfect people? No. Kind of like everybody else. Yes, they were imperfect, but our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, they started us on a journey. A journey, like Dr. Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends towards justice. And that journey, when the Declaration said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that we are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those were radical words. That was a vision. Go back and read Frederick Douglass's speeches. Go back and read Dr. King's speeches, where they made the point, look, when Douglass, many of his most powerful speeches were when we still had slavery, and he decried it passionately, but not by attacking America, but by saying, we're not living up to our ideals. That promise in the Declaration, we're not meeting. Dr. King invoked, just recently I was part of a bunch of senators on the Senate floor reading Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. That was a letter addressed to clergy. And saying if you're a believer, we need to live up to the promise of justice, the promise of equality. We need to speak out, not by tearing down those institutions, by saying let's collectively honor the promises that founded this country.
Well, this defense is such the point here, because a conservative, at the very least, should be able to conserve, George Washington. We need to conserve something. And if we're toppling our founding fathers, we're not conserving very much at all. But there's a relationship between the past and the future. And a country that dishonors its past isn't going to have much of a future. And, we talk sometimes about fiscal issues. A country that saddles the next generation with tens of trillions of dollars in debt, that's the inheritance it leaves to its children, probably is not going to have much of a respectful view of its past either. These issues are related, and I think one thing, Senator, you do very well on the show and elsewhere, is you get to the underlying values that gird our policy debates. And if we're not protecting the father of our country with some reverence, with some admiration, where else can we go? What is our future?
And let me say something about Washington. Look, so many of these mobs that are engaging in violence, they're operating from such profound ignorance. And if you look at Washington and the impact, there are many things he did that were extraordinary, but perhaps the most remarkable is after we won independence, he was offered a monarchy. He was offered, look, it was in an era where people were ruled by kings and queens, and he had just led a victorious revolutionary army, by the way, against the mightiest military on the face of the earth. And had George Washington been a different man, had he been, frankly, the sort of man that many of the dictators of history are littered with, America might well be, we might have a king or queen governing us. And Washington had the humility, had the dedication of principle to say no. And he repeatedly left public life, and he came back. He served as our first president, served 2 terms, and then again he said, I'm going to step down. Look, there's a real possibility Washington could have been president for life. But he set a precedent, okay, look, I'll do this job for a little while, and then I'll leave, and it's important for someone else. And anyone who's watched the musical Hamilton can remember King George's, who's next? John Adams.
And the issue is not enough young Americans, whether going through the school system, going through our higher education institutions, they're not learning those facts about our founders. Michael, I want to get to something you said about conserving something, conservatives wanting to conserve something. And, I hate to be too critical of our own side, but to me it's just true. And you don't often see conservatives marching in the streets to protect something. You don't see them out making their voices heard in the same way you do the left. And the joke that's often said about that as well, that's because Republicans have to go to work. But I think there is a bit of concern, at least for me, as a younger American, and I look at the future. Here's the left out in the streets, rightfully or wrongfully so, protesting for what they want. And I don't see enough of people who agree with us doing the same thing. Are you both concerned about that? What do you think the answer is? Is there another way? Is there another way for conservatives to make their voices heard? We don't control a lot of the institutions, so I think, as you said earlier, so I think to many that it is a big concern.
Of course, I'm not advocating that we get out and scream and shout in the streets. We have to go to work, but we're also civilized people, and we don't want to emulate our adversaries because we think what they're doing is wrong. But
sure.
You're absolutely right. What we need to be able to do is clearly articulate what it is we are standing for. Something we've joked about on the show is that nobody wakes up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat because of marginal tax rates. Okay, nobody is moved.
I may have a couple.
Well, I think the senator has. He's a little wonkier.
Look, I'm a free market guy.
But obviously, I like low taxes as much as the next guy. But the reason that I like low taxes is because of the values that undergird that American political tradition that we have. And so I think we've been talking about doing this show for well over a year. We've been doing the show for over 6 months now. And that is really what we're trying to get at. We're trying to give people the arguments and an explanation of the values that undergird what we're fighting for. Because if we could express that, even in the realms that are available to us right now, I think the message would be unstoppable.
Eduardo, one of the most frequent comments we'll get on the podcast, whether it's on YouTube or on the audio podcast download, is people who say, you know what, I learned something. I learned something I didn't know on an issue, whether it's talking about China, whether it's talking about impeachment, whether it's talking about free speech or the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or the Constitution or milk on the Senate floor, that the people are like, hey, and we try to, they're all about a half hour, so it's not, so much that, it's hopefully enough time that like you're driving to work or whatever that you could, or you're, running on the treadmill or whatever you're doing, that you can. But we try to actually engage in things that are useful. And actually, I haven't told you this. Do you know who listens to our podcast?
Who?
Heidi.
Really?
My wife.
That's pretty good.
I cannot get Heidi to listen to me talk 30 minutes on any topic at the dinner
phone,
table. Like it just, she is my best friend in the world. I adore Heidi, but it was funny. Some time ago, someone asked my daughter Caroline, said, wow, does your dad talk a lot at home? She's like, no, he doesn't talk at all. Mom does all the talking.
Yeah, he's not allowed.
A lot of truth to that. But she actually downloads our podcast every week because she says she finds interesting things that she then uses talking with friends, talking with colleagues, like whatever the news of the day is. And I don't think on the right, whether you're conservative, whether you're libertarian, whether you're constitutionalist, I don't think we do enough to help arm people with the facts and substance and arguments that you need to defend Washington, that you need to defend, to talk about Frederick Douglass or Dr. King or racial justice. We had Tim Scott on the podcast, and he played 2 voicemails that he had received in his office from angry bigots attacking him. And, the left is often very bigoted and racist. And those, look, they were grotesque voicemails, but I think they were also pretty real. And he just pulled up his phone and played it on the podcast.
Right.
This, you would never hear those voicemails in the mainstream media. They would never allow them to be played or even the story to get out. And I think this is the point. I'm very pleased to hear that Heidi listens to it because, the left is always on the same page. They always have their arguments. Why? Because they hear them at school, they hear them on the mainstream media, they hear them in Hollywood, they hear them in big tech, they hear them everywhere, right? The left controls all the major institutions. And I think part of that divide and conquer strategy is not allowing the conservative arguments to get out. And so for right now, at least until we get banned at the end of this interview, for right now, that avenue is available, and that's what we're trying to put out there.
Well, gentlemen, I think we're out of time, but I want to thank you both for joining us. I want to encourage all the viewers to go to theverdictpodcast.com, subscribe on iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast to get more of this great pair. Senator Cruz, I do have one more quick question for you before we go. Conservatives have been let down a lot by the Supreme Court in recent weeks. So very quick question, will we ever see a Justice Cruz on the Supreme Court? Is that something you would ever want to do, and might we see it?
No time soon. So it's a kind question to ask. I care passionately about the court, and you're right, it has been grievously disappointing. John Roberts in particular, a whole series of decisions have been really deeply unprincipled. I'll confess that is an opportunity and a choice that I've faced before with both of the vacancies that President Trump had. He and I had very serious conversations about it. In both instances, I said, no, I didn't want the job. And the reason is a principled judge stays out of political fights. A principled judge stays out of policy fights. If I were a federal judge, I probably wouldn't be doing this podcast.
Right.
I wouldn't be on the Senate floor battling against tearing down our statues. Why? Because if I was a judge, I might have to rule on a case dealing with tearing down the statues. So you can't be a judge and engage in the battle. And I think think of the great debates. You were saying, how come no one is standing up defending America? You're right. Nobody is putting on the armor and getting into the arena. And when you do, they beat the living daylights out of you. So I think I can have a more positive impact in the Senate fighting for the liberties that make America great. And I hope to be part of nominating and confirming hundreds of principled constitutionalist judges. I just don't particularly want me to be one of them.
Well, that's a fair answer. Again, I want to thank you both. That is The Verdict with Ted Cruz and Michael Knowles. Thank you so much for doing this with us again.